645 million euros. That was the asking price of the world's most expensive hydrogen yacht. Yet, she cannot cross the Atlantic on hydrogen. Her name is Breakthrough. Built by Feadship in Amsterdam, she is 118.8 meters long and the first superyacht powered by liquid hydrogen. I've spent 20 years selling motor yachts, and I need to tell you something you won't hear at any yacht show stand. First, a disclaimer, because without it, everything that follows would be unfair. This is not a film against Feadship. The yard has done an exceptional job. Someone had to build it. The engineering was executed to the highest standard. She was named Ship of the Year, and deservedly so. The problem is how the lessons from this project are now being sold to clients. Because Breakthrough's real lesson is very different from the brochure narrative. She remained on the market for 493 days and sold in September 2025. Neither party disclosed the final sale price. Today, I'll give you 3 numbers that settle the matter. Not opinions, but figures supplied by the yard itself and dictated by physics. But the answer to one question may surprise you most. Something had to disappear from this yacht to make room for hydrogen. And it wasn't the owner's suite. If you attended Monaco, Fort Lauderdale or Düsseldorf this year, you saw the same thing. Yacht show stands covered in renderings of hulls, emitting nothing but water vapor. Zero emissions. Silent nights at anchor in protected bays. A yacht you no longer need to justify to your grandchildren. It is a very effective message. It targets the one place where the owner of a large yacht may feel vulnerable today. Not the wallet, the conscience. The problem is that physics stands between a rendering and a launch. And physics does not negotiate. Let's look at the projects that tried to move from presentation to construction. CNOT's 112-meter liquid hydrogen concept Aqua toured the world. It was never built. Baglietto is developing a metal hydride system. A land-based prototype was built, but I still have no confirmation that it has been installed aboard any yacht. San Lorenzo, more committed to fuel cells than any other Italian yard, took the stage in June, not to unveil a yacht, but to appeal to the European Commission for infrastructure. Its chairman summed it up in one sentence. The technology is ready. The challenge is ensuring that infrastructure and fuel availability keep pace. When the chairman of the yard that has invested most heavily in this propulsion technology says that publicly, it isn't marketing, it is a warning. Now for the number that frames this entire debate. Across global commercial shipping, just one hydrogen-fueled ship was ordered in the first half of this year. 1. 73 were ordered for LNG. The entire alternative fuel market has slowed. 119 contracts in 5 months. LNG and battery-powered vessels lead. Hydrogen and ammonia sit at the bottom. That is why I write and speak about Breakthrough. She is the only real-world benchmark in this debate. Everything else is still a rendering. She genuinely operates. She has genuinely bunkered hydrogen. And she has genuinely changed hands. That makes her the strongest argument against the technology she was meant to usher in. It all comes down to one measure that promotional material barely mentions: energy density by volume. Diesel contains about 35.8 megajoules per liter. Methanol just under 16. Liquid hydrogen 8.5. Compressed hydrogen 4.8. At fuel level alone, hydrogen therefore requires more than 4 times the volume of diesel to carry the same amount of energy. But a liquid hydrogen tank is not an ordinary fuel tank. It is a double-walled cryogenic vessel with a vacuum between the walls. It holds a liquid more than 90 degrees colder than LNG, minus 253 degrees Celsius. It must be cylindrical or spherical, because those shapes can withstand the pressure differential. A yacht's hull has completely different geometry. Diesel tanks can be shaped around the machinery spaces, so they rarely dictate a conventional yacht's architecture. A cryogenic tank does. The entire vessel must be designed around it. Feadship says this openly. Storing hydrogen takes 8 to 10 times more space than the energy equivalent amount of diesel. Now for a detail worth remembering. Breakthrough's hydrogen tank has a total capacity of 92 cubic meters. And this is where the figure that stopped me appears. The tank is not filled to capacity. Its maximum fill is 69%. The rest is mandatory headspace for boil-off. 69%. That is the first of three numbers. You pay for 92 cubic meters of tank volume, but carry only 63 cubic meters of hydrogen. In practice, the yacht carries about 4.5 tons of hydrogen. 1 cubic meter of liquid hydrogen weighs about 70 kilograms. The same volume of diesel weighs roughly 800. Let's do the calculation. 4.5 tons of hydrogen contain roughly the same energy as 13.5 cubic meters of diesel. That is about the fuel capacity of a typical 40-meter motor yacht. To carry that amount of energy, Feadship needed a tank volume 7 times larger. And the calculation does not end there. Then comes the weight. The tank alone, with its vacuum insulation and support structure, weighs well over 30 tons. Add the fuel cells and associated equipment, and the system exceeds 40 tons, all to carry 4.5 tons of fuel. It is also important to understand the different ratios used in this debate. 4:1 describes the energy density of the fuel itself. 7:1 relates to the tank volume. Feadship's figure of 8:10 includes the tank and all the supporting infrastructure around it. All three figures are valid. Each measures something different, and none appears in the sales brochure. Because the tank is cylindrical and requires surrounding safety zones, the yacht had to be lengthened by 4 meters from the original specification. The deck arrangement was not simply optimized to absorb it. The hull itself was lengthened by 4 meters. Now let's put a value on that space. The asking price was 645 million euros, and the yacht is about 118 meters long. That works out at roughly 5.4 million euros per linear meter. 4 additional meters of hull devoted to the hydrogen installation, therefore, represent about 21 million euros of value. That is the price of the space required by the system. 21 million euros. That is the second number, the cost of a section of hull that creates no guest living space. Now for the answer I promised at the beginning. 4 meters is what you can see from outside. Inside, something happened that no press release mentions. On a yacht of this size, the engine room would normally be arranged over 2 decks, allowing proper service access and day-to-day operation. Here that arrangement was abandoned. The machinery spaces were condensed onto a single deck to accommodate the tank, connection chamber, and fuel cells. And the space surrendered was not the owner's suite. It was the crew quarters. The owner did not give up a bathroom or a saloon. The space came from the people who live and work aboard for 6 months of the year. That is the real currency of this decision. The installation also requires equipment no conventional yacht carries, including a 40-meter vent mast that discharges boil-off gas safely above deck. Its pipework must be purged with nitrogen to remove oxygen. The entire area surrounding the installation is classified as a hazardous zone. Apply that to your own project. On a 100-meter yacht, 4 meters could mean an ensuite suite with a dressing room, or an entire beach club with a gym and direct access to the swim platform. Now for the least discussed drawback of this technology, because almost nobody explains it to clients. Hydrogen boils off, not because of a leak or defective workmanship, but because of physics. Any heat entering through the insulation raises the tank pressure, however good that insulation is. The excess gas must be vented. There is another factor. A slow molecular conversion occurs inside liquid hydrogen, releasing about 527 kilojoules per kilogram. That is more than hydrogen's latent heat of vaporization. In effect, the fuel heats itself from within. Feadship has not published Breakthrough's boil-off rate. I'm not going to guess it. But I do know the published range for tanks of this class, from 0.3% per day with excellent insulation, through a typical 0.5% to more than 1% in rolling marine conditions. So let's model 3 weeks of idle time. At 0.3% per day, the yacht loses about 275 kilograms of hydrogen. At 0.5%, 450 kilograms. At the rate commonly used for marine models under roll, more than 900. That is 1/5 of the hydrogen bunkered lost during 3 weeks alongside. And note this. Feadship itself explains the 69% fill limit by saying that hydrogen begins warming and boiling off immediately after bunkering. The existence of a 40-meter controlled vent mast answers any question about whether boil-off is a real operational issue. For the owner, this creates something unfamiliar on a conventional yacht. She sits idle for 3 weeks, nobody lives aboard, the engines are cold, yet the fuel level falls. There is no pause button. The clock starts the moment the hydrogen is bunkered. Assume the owner accepts all of this. 4 meters of hull surrendered, fuel lost while idle, and the ambition to own the first yacht of its kind in the marina. The practical question is simple. Where can she bunker hydrogen? Today's answer is equally simple. Nowhere on a routine basis. Breakthrough has 2 publicly documented hydrogen bunkering operations. The first took place in Amsterdam in May 2025. It was the first liquid hydrogen bunkering operation in Dutch history. The regional environmental authority had to devise the safety procedure from scratch, because no such procedure existed. The second took place in August at Port Vauban in Antibes. It was announced as the world's first liquid hydrogen bunkering of a yacht in a marina. Now listen carefully to the wording used in the port's announcement. Because the bunkering is completed from a road tanker within a few hours, no permanent installation or liquid hydrogen storage is required. That was presented as an advantage. I read it differently. It is an admission that the infrastructure does not exist. Today, there is not one permanent liquid hydrogen bunkering point for yachts anywhere in the Mediterranean. Not one. What we do have are promises. 100 stations by 2030. Programs worth 100 million euros. And letters of intent. In April this year, La Spezia carried out a trial bunkering operation using port tankers. Monaco has a pontoon producing 1 liter of hydrogen per minute to fill small cylinders for student boats. It is an excellent educational initiative. But for bunkering a 100-meter yacht, it is as relevant as a phone charger is to powering a house. Then there is the legal position. In France, an installation storing more than 100 kilograms of hydrogen must be formally notified. Above 1 ton, it requires full authorization, including an environmental impact assessment and public consultation. Under the law, a marina offering routine bunkering of 4 tons of hydrogen would cease to be merely a marina. It becomes an industrial installation, with all the consequences that entails, including the neighbor's right to take part in consultations. Now to maritime regulation. Sellers often overlook this part, but it may have a direct effect on resale value. The IGF code governs ships using low flashpoint fuels, but it does not cover hydrogen. It did not cover it while Breakthrough was being built, and it is still not mandatory for hydrogen today. Interim guidelines were completed in September last year and approved in May this year. They are still not a mandatory code, and there is no date for hydrogen's inclusion in the IGF code. Breakthrough was therefore built without a detailed mandatory code and approved under the so-called alternative design procedure. This was a case-by-case approval based on a risk assessment agreed with the Classification Society and the Flag Administration. The tank suppliers said so openly. There were no standards or codes against which this design could be approved. Now for the most interesting point. The draft guidelines say that hydrogen storage systems should be installed on open decks. Breakthrough's tank is below deck. The Classification Society described it as the first installation of its kind in the world. I am not claiming that this invalidates her certification. Yachts built before new rules enter into force are generally grandfathered. I am saying that every future seller will have to explain why the tank sits where the new guidelines say it should not. And in this market, that sort of conversation ends in a discount. Crew competence is another issue. STCW requires officers responsible for the fuel to have participated in at least 3 bunkering operations aboard such a vessel. With the global fleet still counted in individual yachts, very few officers can meet that requirement. Anyone who has recruited crew for a yacht with a non-standard system knows what follows. A qualified candidate knows how rare that experience is and prices it accordingly. Finally, insurance. I need to be precise here because the market repeats many figures that nobody can substantiate. There is no public evidence that hydrogen yacht premiums are higher by any specific percentage. There is no tariff. But that absence is not good news. Quite the opposite. The International Union of Marine Insurance put it plainly. These fuels remain largely untested, and the industry lacks the operating history and claims data needed for reliable risk assessment. In its comparative analysis, hydrogen received the lowest technology readiness rating of all the fuels considered. Methanol ranked higher. Ammonia ranked higher. Hydrogen was last. Underwriters price risk using claims history. For hydrogen yachts, that history does not exist because there is no fleet yet. And risk that cannot be measured will not be priced cheaply. Remember what is being handled. Hydrogen is flammable in air at concentrations from 4 to 75%. Petrol from 1.5 to just under 8. Hydrogen's minimum ignition energy is about 10 times lower than petrol's. Its flame is also almost invisible in daylight. This is not an argument that a hydrogen yacht will explode. Breakthrough was built by a yard that understands the risks, under class supervision. It is an argument that such a yacht requires specialist competence from the crew, the port, and the insurer. And that competence is not yet standard in any of the three. Now let's turn to the numbers, because ultimately the economics decide. A full load of 4 tons of liquid hydrogen costs about 54,000 euros, based on figures from the only operator using this fuel routinely. 4 tons of hydrogen contain 133 megawatt-hours of chemical energy. After the fuel cells, only about 70 megawatt-hours remain available aboard. That puts the cost at roughly 700 euros per megawatt-hour of electricity. By comparison, diesel costs roughly $80 to $120 per megawatt-hour. Hydrogen is still the most expensive energy source you can bunker into a yacht today. Why is it so expensive when hydrogen itself is abundant? Because it first has to be produced, then cooled. Electrolysis consumes about 55 kilowatt-hours of electricity per kilogram of hydrogen, while that kilogram contains only 33 kilowatt-hours of energy. Liquefaction consumes another dozen or so kilowatt-hours per kilogram. The fuel cell then returns roughly half the energy it receives. The complete chain, from green electricity ashore to power at the yacht's switchboard, is only about 25% efficient. For every kilowatt-hour used aboard, 4 kilowatt-hours must be generated ashore. 4 to 1, that is the third number. 4 units of energy go in for 1 usable unit aboard. And that is before road transport and the hydrogen lost to boil off along the way. A Norwegian ferry demonstrates this better than any table. It consumes about 104 tons of hydrogen a year, producing an annual fuel bill of roughly 1.4 million euros. If the same ferry ran on batteries, its energy cost would fall below 100,000 euros. The operator says hydrogen operation costs 3 to 4 times more than conventional fuels. Hydrogen reaches the ferry by road tanker from Germany, a journey of 1,300 kilometers each way every 2 weeks. Now consider the equipment. In serious orders, a marine fuel cell system costs about 3 times as much as a diesel genset of the same output. And here is the detail press releases tend to lose. Breakthrough has roughly 3 megawatts of fuel cells and 5 conventional gensets, producing more than 9 megawatts in total. The yacht, therefore, carries 2 complete power generation systems. The conventional system handles longer passages. Hydrogen supports hotel load, silent operation at anchor, and coastal cruising at about 10 knots. A week of quiet at anchor, or emission-free entry into a protected bay. And here is the crucial point. The quoted range of 6,500 nautical miles is not a hydrogen range. It is achieved on conventional fuel burned in the generators. That is not a criticism. Feadship clearly states that hotel load accounts for between 70 and 78% of a yacht's annual energy use. So targeting that part of the energy demand makes engineering sense. The owner simply needs to understand what he is paying for. Not a zero-emission yacht, but an additional, very expensive and very large onboard power plant to run hotel services at anchor. Service life is another question. The first marine module with standard class approval claims more than 15,000 operating hours. Published literature gives a range of 5,000 to 35,000 hours. The 80,000-hour figure, sometimes quoted by salespeople, is a research target, not a current product specification. Fuel cells last longest under steady load and degrade more quickly with frequent starts. That variable operating profile is normal on a yacht, not exceptional. What does a replacement fuel cell stack cost? Nobody outside the manufacturer knows. I checked this carefully. None of the leading manufacturers publishes replacement prices or marine service rates. I will not give you an invented percentage of hull value because no defensible figure exists. Instead, I will tell you what I consider even more concerning. The buyer signs a contract for an asset whose 4 key economic parameters remain unknown to the market. Boil-off rate, fuel cell replacement cost, insurance premium, residual value. No other asset class at this price point would accept so many unknowns. And finally, resale. I will not juggle percentages here either, because the secondary market for hydrogen yachts currently consists of one transaction. But that single transaction is revealing. The yacht came to market at an asking price of 645 million euros. That is roughly 89,000 euros per gross ton. She remained listed for 493 days. She sold in September last year, but neither party disclosed the transaction price. She was immediately offered for charter at 3.5 million euros per week. The superyacht market follows fairly predictable depreciation patterns. A yacht typically loses 10 to 20% in its first year, and 40 to 50% after 5 years. Every experienced broker also knows that highly customized yachts are harder to resell. An unconventional propulsion system is one of the most effective ways to deter the next buyer. This prototype carries both burdens. Contrary to popular belief, there is no tax benefit to offset them. I checked this carefully and found no tax relief or incentive program aimed specifically at yachts with alternative propulsion. Regulatory costs rise on one side. On the incentive side, there is nothing. The asymmetry is complete. So what do I tell a client who says they no longer want to run on diesel? I start with what I will not tell them. I will not tell them to wait for a reactor. I check the market project by project. There is no reactor-powered yacht in operation, under construction, or in the order book. Yachting has only one nuclear concept, a 100-meter yacht with 2 reactors. It remains a rendering. History is unforgiving. America's Savannah was withdrawn because it proved a technical success, but an economic failure. Germany's Otto Hahn was converted to diesel because every foreign port call required government negotiations. Japan's Mutsu suffered a leak during its early trials. Those are 3 different failure modes, and none has been resolved for yachting. A yacht needs freedoms that a commercial vessel does not. It calls at destinations of maximum political sensitivity and carries civilian guests. Methanol deserves a more serious discussion, but it is still not the solution it is often presented as. The only yacht I can confirm with certainty uses methanol has a fuel cell rated at 100 kilowatts. 100 kilowatts. Enough for air conditioning and the galley, but not for propulsion. The second case is a 114-meter yacht designed with half-megawatt fuel cell modules. However, reports conflict on whether those fuel cells were installed before delivery, so I will not pretend to resolve it. 2 years after launch, the answer still cannot be established from public sources. That alone says something about the technology's maturity. Methanol bunkering is available in 48 ports worldwide, compared with more than 200 for LNG. Less than 1% of global methanol production comes from renewable sources, and methanol still has no mandatory code. What genuinely works today is far less dramatic, which is precisely why it does not make the covers. First, HVO, a fuel made from hydrotreated vegetable oils and waste fats. Chemically, it is very close to fossil diesel, but sulfur-free. It is a drop-in fuel for existing engines and requires no modification. Life cycle carbon dioxide emissions can be reduced by up to 90%. Leading engine manufacturers have approved their ranges for HVO, and one yard says every new yacht leaves the factory with HVO in its tanks. But we should be honest. Nitrogen oxide emissions fall by only a few percent. HVO does not solve the local air quality problem in ports, and nobody should sell it as if it does. The usual objection is that HVO cannot scale because feedstock is limited and aviation will pay more. That is a valid and serious argument when applied to the roughly 300 million tons of bunker fuel consumed annually by global shipping. The global yacht fleet, however, consumes only a tiny fraction of that volume. Yachting is the one maritime segment whose demand HVO can cover today without waiting for supply to scale. The owner simply has to accept the price premium. In this industry, a fuel premium of around 10% is barely noticeable beside the cost of maintaining a full crew for one season. Second, a hybrid system with a properly sized battery bank. Production ready, not a demonstration. One Feadship carries a 4.5 megawatt-hour bank comprising 560 modules in a cooled battery room. It provides 35 nautical miles at 10 knots on batteries alone, or 10 to 15 hours at anchor without starting a generator. Another yard installs a 1 megawatt-hour battery bank and claims 8 hours of silent hotel operation. A further builder reports up to 24% lower fuel consumption and up to 85% lower nitrogen oxide emissions from its hybrid system. And this is the point the hydrogen debate keeps missing. The real sales argument for batteries is not environmental. The real sales argument is that at 2 in the morning in a quiet bay, the generator is off. An owner who has spent one night aboard without vibration or ventilation noise will not want to return to the old arrangement. The emissions reduction then becomes a side benefit, real, available now, and difficult to give up. When clients arrive with a brochure full of zero-emission claims, I advise them to ask the yard several precise questions and not leave without written answers. That is not discourteous. It is standard due diligence. First, what percentage of annual energy demand does the advertised system cover, and under what operating profile? If the answer covers only hotel load at anchor, the yacht's propulsion still runs on diesel. Second, how many meters of hull and how many square meters of usable space did the system consume compared with the same yacht in conventional form? Do not accept a vague answer such as, "We optimized the layout." Third, where, specifically and by name, can this fuel be bunkered within the yacht's intended cruising area? Is it a permanent facility or a road tanker operation requiring a separate permit every time? Fourth, what is the tank's declared daily boil-off rate, and what happens to the fuel that boils off? If the yard will not provide that figure, the omission is information in itself. Fifth, and most uncomfortable, identify a comparable yacht that has resold on the secondary market and disclose the transaction price. If no such yacht exists, and none does today, the buyer is not simply buying a yacht. He is buying a stake in an experiment and should value it accordingly, at a discount, not a premium. Let's return to the three numbers. 69%. The proportion of the tank capacity you can actually use. 21 million euros. The value of the 4 additional meters of hull. 4 to 1. The energy put in for every usable unit recovered aboard. I do not believe Feadship made a mistake by building this yacht. Someone had to do it. It was executed to the highest possible standard, and the industry learned more from it than from a decade of conferences. What I do believe is unfair is the way the conclusions from this project are now being sold to clients. The real conclusion is this. Hydrogen is being used to cover the hotel load of a 119-meter yacht. To achieve that, the hull had to be lengthened by 4 meters and the machinery spaces compressed onto one deck at the expense of the crew quarters. A precedent-setting cryogenic vessel had to be installed below deck, a case-by-case approval negotiated, and tanker bunkering arranged in just 2 European ports. Hydrogen currently costs several times more than diesel, while a complete conventional power system is still required for longer passages. And the yacht was ultimately sold at a price neither party disclosed. That is the description of a prototype. Prototypes are perfectly valid, provided they are called prototypes and priced as prototypes. Sustainable yachting will not arrive through frozen gas or a reactor. It will come from less spectacular solutions that are available now. First, renewable fuel that can cut life cycle emissions by 90% without replacing the engines. Next, A properly sized battery that shuts the generator down overnight, together with heat recovery, a lower resistance hull, and a sensible reduction in installed power. And finally, using the yacht for more than 6 weeks a year. The greatest emissions reduction in this industry comes from fewer empty repositioning passages and better seasonal planning. But that cannot be sold as an option in a build contract. That is why nobody discusses it at yacht show stands. Thermodynamics does not care what the yacht is called. It cares about the energy balance. With liquid hydrogen, 4 units of energy must be produced for 1 usable unit aboard, and 4 meters of hull must be surrendered to achieve it. To an owner who genuinely wants to reduce their yacht's environmental footprint today, I give the same advice I have given for 2 years. Bunker renewable fuel, fit a proper battery bank, and use the yacht more often. That works, costs a fraction of the hydrogen solution, and requires no faith in a press release. One more thing. I know this film will leave you with specific questions. Leave them in the comments. I will collect them and make a separate live episode in which I answer them one by one. And if you want to see how the same industry manipulates range figures on conventional motor yachts, this film is waiting on screen. Click now.